Constantine, a Hellblazer podcast.
Hey there, everybody, and welcome back. Before we get into the episode, just want to let you know that this is the free version of the podcast, and all that means is that we are way behind where I'm at in Patreon. So if you are loving this podcast and you need more John Constantine in your life, definitely go check us out at patreon.com/planes, trains, and comic books and sign up for the Hellblazer tier, where you'll get access to the entire Hellblazer library that I've recorded so far. And also you get access to the exclusive episodes of the Planes, Trains, and Comic Books main podcast. So if any of that sounds good to you, definitely go over to patreon.com/planes, trains, and comic books, all one word, and sign up there. And with that out of the way, let's get into the issue. Hey there, everybody, and welcome back to John Constantine, a Hellblazer podcast. I'm very excited about today's episode because this is it. This is the final issue of the Garth Ennis run of Hellblazer. And just a little catch up on what's been going on in this last story arc. There's kind of three stories that have been interwoven. One of those involves a young man named George, who is the brother of one of John's friends who died. And he is on the run from the police because he killed a police officer after they came to arrest him and they killed his mom in the process. So he's been hiding out in his neighborhood, and the police tried to mount some sort of raid on that neighborhood to try to find George, but the residents did not want that to happen, so they gathered in protest, and then a police officer shot one of George's friends named Will in the neck with a big rubber bullet, and it killed him. And this sparked a riot from the residents. So now there's just chaos and mayhem and murder in the streets. And George has unfortunately seen all of his friends from the neighborhood be killed by police. But in the last issue, he was able to evade arrest, at least so far. The second story that's been going on is John happened to see a prostitute on the street who looked a lot like an old ex-girlfriend named Helen. And it turns out that it was her, and that she was addicted to heroin, and she was now a prostitute. So he pulled her off the street, he had Chaz beat up her pimp, and then he drove off with her to force her to detox. So he tied her up in his house, and unfortunately, the pimp named Philip was not going to leave it just at that, so he ended up finding her, and he beat and raped her, and he would have killed her except that Chaz happened to come in and see this going on and scared Philip off. So furious from this, John actually asked Chaz to hire a couple of goons to beat Philip up, and they went a little overboard. Apparently, they paralyzed him for life, or possibly even killed him. They didn't show the actual last scene of them beating him, so all we heard was John's side of a telephone conversation with Chaz about what happened, and Chaz told him that the goons went a little overboard and Philip would never walk again. And the final story, of course, is John Constantine's storyline. The first of the Fallen is after him, and he's been trying to figure out over the last 5 issues how to defeat the First of the Fallen. And he had a couple good plans, but each of them was taken down by the First of the Fallen before they could even be implemented. And in the last issue, we saw that John went to his friend Nigel's apartment, which just happens to be in the center of the area where the riots and police beatings are going on. So he was able to sneak into there. But when he got there, the First of the Fallen had already got to his friend Nigel, so he was dead. So the First of the Fallen got to him before we even heard what the plan was for Nigel. So in despair, John walked over to the balcony to stare at the burning city below him. And out of nowhere, the First of the Fallen appeared behind him. I guess he'd been waiting for John. And that was where we left off. We don't know what's going to happen, but the First of the Fallen has finally found John. But first things first, we got the cover here for issue 83. It is a portrait of a very cocky John Constantine. He's looking at us. He's got a little bit of a smile. He's smoking a cigarette, and he's got slightly messy hair like he's just been through something. And the collar of his trench coat is popped up like he's super cool. And we also see, of course, that this issue was written by Garth Ennis with art by Steve Dillon. And as we turn to the first page, we see a full splash of John Constantine on the ground, on his knees, and he is clutching at his midsection like he's in extreme pain, and he's vomiting blood. And as he's doing this, off panel, we hear the First of the Fallen say, "The air pressure alters and the air fills up with artichokes. A smell of piss and sodium, a noise like bitches twisting inwards, caught and left for carrion, razor light, and I fall." And just like us, John is confused by what the First of the Fallen is saying, So after he's done puking his guts, he says, "What the fuck? What are you on about?" And then we cut to a panel of the First of the Fallen, and he's reading some sort of book as he stands next to Nigel's corpse, and he says, "It's your friend's poetry. The 29-year-old teenage rebel. Execrable, isn't it? How does a bitch twist inwards? And is it only me, or do poems that don't rhyme reflect a fundamental lack of effort?" And then he reads another line saying, "Blank verse is the verse of freedom." And then he kind of side-eyes Nigel's corpse and says, "I do despise little masturbators like this, winking himself blind until he couldn't see his feminist principles and hiding his Mayfairs under a complete run of socialist worker. There's a couple of publications that often go hand in hand." And then he turns his attention back to John and says, "Really, killing him was an act of mercy. Do you know what he called me before he died? A dirty Tory bastard. Bless his tearful righteous outrage and his cute little upraised fist. Power to the workers," he sobbed. And John grits his teeth in pain and asks, "What have you done to me?" And the First of the Fallen gives a little smile and says, "Giving you back your lung cancer." Then he's distracted by one of the titles of the poems and he says, "Oh, there's one called Bombs." And John tries to swear at the First of the Fallen, but he's in so much pain that he can't. And the First of the Fallen drops the book of poetry and he says, "You're not blaming me, are you? I wasn't the one on 30 silk cut a day. I wasn't the one who went off at life like a half-assed gambler either. Do you remember the last time we met under circumstances like these? With me standing tall above you, you spitting your lungs out on a cold and lonely floor?" If you remember, this is like pretty much a full circle here, because in the first story arc of Garth Ennis' run called Dangerous Habits, that is where John got his lung cancer cured. So now we're back exactly where we started. Of course, John remembers that and says, "Not likely to forget, am I?" And the First of the Fallen walks past John towards the balcony and he says, "Of course not. Nor am I. Listening helplessly while you laid out every detail of the trap you caught me in. Blood and triumph dribbling from between your gritted teeth, and the lurching horror when I realized I was beaten. And then that gesture, the one you couldn't resist. Well, talk about gilding the lily. Only once have I felt as wretched as you made me feel that day. Only once. It was when I picked myself up from the longest fall of all, and I remembered what I'd seen in the eyes of the Almighty, and I wept with pity for the world he had created." And he's saying this as he's looking down on the town that's burning below them from the balcony. And in response to what the first just said, John says, "Bollocks. You wouldn't know what pity was if someone stuck it up your arsehole." And the first replies, "Your own experience has taught you that the angels feel pride and lust and even hatred. To live in light, you must understand the darkness. The reverse is also true. If you knew what I do about the Lord's creation, Constantine, you would believe me when I talk of pity." And then John kind of thinks over what he just heard, and he says, "This wouldn't be the thing you told the priest." And what he's talking about here is the Hellblazer special from the middle of the Garth Ennis run, where we found out that John, as a teenager, had almost been sexually assaulted and murdered by a priest. And this was because the priest was told by the First of the Fallen something. We didn't hear what it was. So John is thinking that what the First of the Fallen is talking about now is what he told the priest to make him go crazy. But it's interesting because the First of the Fallen says, "What priest?" So it's kind of funny because this moment that means a lot to John in his past doesn't seem to have stuck with the First of the Fallen in the same way. So John reminds him saying, "The bloody hell, the head case, towards the end of the 60s, Tolly." And that jogs the first memory, and he says, "Him? Oh, what a prick." And John continues to explain, saying, "He said you confessed something to him, and that's what turned him barmy. He burned his church down and turned into a bleeding mass murderer." And at this, the First of the Fallen turns back around from the balcony and walks back into the apartment towards John and says, "And do you think it would do the same to you?" And John sarcastically replies, "No, but it might cheer me up a bit. Let's hear it then." So the First of the Fallen sits down next to John, and as John begins to vomit again, he tells John what he told the priest, saying, "In the beginning, Before the heaven and the earth and the angels and so on, God created me. I wasn't the devil then, didn't even have a name, but I could see and touch and think and speak, which I assumed was why I was created in the first place, so he'd have someone to talk to. He had a lot to talk about. He planned to build a golden kingdom peopled by beautiful and kindly angels, and far below it would be a universe of stars and moons and planets, all interlinked, all relying on each other like a perfect piece of clockwork. Life on the planets would be like that too, animal and vegetable, carnivore and herbivore, ecosystems so complex and yet so perfectly simple that they could never fail. I imagined stars at dawn and moonlight snowfields, whale song in the marinas, tiger tracks in endless green, wings so wide that a world could shelter under them. And I shouted yes until my tears ran through my smile. And that was what I thought was intended. He would use the power he had for marvelous creation, never tiring of the variety and depth of beauty he could endlessly bring to the universe. An endless palette, an endless canvas. And John interjects, "With you nodding approval from the sidelines, I suppose." And the first replies, "I don't deny it. A guiding hand on the tiller, with everyone's best interests at heart, and that's where I made my first mistake." And as John wipes his mouth, he cuts in, saying, "I was wondering when the trouble in paradise was coming. Look, if I've got to die, I've got to die, but less messy would be better. It's like talking through a sodden swamp." And the first of the fallen looks over at John, very annoyed at this, and says, "Just sit there and bleed quietly then." And then he continues his story, saying, he'd planned to enhance his creation with a new race he'd been thinking about. Its chief characteristic was the replacement of instinct with the rather grandiose concept of free will. Disastrous notion, of course. Offer a choice, and 9 out of 10 people will instantly make the wrong one. Asking for trouble, I told him so. And then the first of the fallen looks down and gets kind of sad, and he says, "I still remember the look he gave me. One eye narrow, one eye wide." "What did you say?" "I had that plummeting free-for-all sensation that only the most exquisite faux pas can bring to a conversation. The dreadful awareness that words can never heal a wound, and nothing can ever be the same again." And then John kind of quotes what would be an example of a faux pas like this, and he says, "At least he went out with a bang, Miss Cobain." Of course, referencing that Kurt Cobain from Nirvana killed himself with a shotgun, and that this would be the biggest faux pas you could say to Courtney Love, his wife. And the first of the fallen agrees and says, "That's the kind of thing." And the first continues, saying, "What could I do? I no longer had his ear. I had no more idea of what he planned than the angels did. I was terrified. I skulked around the kingdom of heaven like a wayward infant, expecting his father's voice of justice with every step he takes. Well, if you put all your energy into dodging someone for long enough, sooner or later, you'll run right into them. I crept backwards through an archway one starlit afternoon, certain I was being pursued. And there he was. I found the great Redeemer, squatting in a corner of eternity, clutching at his genitals and drooling." And John cuts in, "Mad as arseholes, in other words." And the first of the fallen looks at John with agreement and says, "And that's why he gave humanity the choice, and why he imagined they'd pick him. Why a loving God would curse his creation with centuries of pain. Why a supreme being is so enamored of free will." And John sarcastically says, "And there was me thinking, he just moved in mysterious ways." And the first replies, "Oh, I know. A child of 4 could see through that one. Anyway, he knew I knew, and he threw me out of heaven, and I've been falling ever since." And then the first of the fallen stands up again, and he continues saying, "After that, he went ahead with it anyway. The heavenly hosts weren't much more than a dry run for humanity. And look at them now, stormtroopers with halos. Down below, my purpose was clear. I had to storm the walls of heaven, to bring sanity to the heart of creation, and the only way to do that was to raise an army. So I took advantage of the choice he was so keen on, and I offered one of my own. I offered, and I bribed, cajoled and threatened, and my realm and my soul legions grew and grew. The other fallen appeared, but what were they but distractions? On and on I went, my eyes forever on my goal, my dream of earthly paradise before me, and then, bang, there was you. Had I the sense I was created with, I'd have walked away from you. So he beat me. Big deal. Forget about it, and get on with the job in hand. And then he walks over to John, and he puts his hand on John's cheek, and he says, "No, I couldn't. You really hooked me, Constantine. You twisted me, and turned me, and woke me right up." And then he steps back from John and continues saying, "The methods I employed had their effect on me, I know. The tools I use are lust and envy, hate and avarice. What good would I be in building us a better world? My reactions, decisions, are all based on hatred. I saw the frenzy I got into over a little thing like you, and I knew myself. I am exactly what the devil should be. The tempter, the deceiver, the serpent crawling in the garden, the adversary, the figure I'd sneered at in 100 paintings, the role I'd laughed so hard at when I read it in the fictions, and here I am. But ever since I fell, I've wondered down the eons what he meant for me. What sense of purpose dredged me from within that mind? What was the point of someone he could talk to if he wouldn't even listen? And that has torn at me since." But he's cut off as John very calmly and coolly takes a cigarette, lights it, and says, "Easy." And the first turns around kind of angry and says, "What?" And John looks him right in the eyes and says, "You're his conscience. You were that little voice everyone gets in their head, chum, except you were in his. Come on, don't do that. Do this. Don't say that. Don't be nasty. Don't hurt her. Don't have that last drink. Get on home. Do the right thing. That was you." And the first tries to cut in, saying, "Are you aware?" But John doesn't let him. He just smiles and continues saying, "Nah, sod the threats. Think about it. He takes that nagging little whine out of his bonce, and he gives it a body. And the minute you step out of line, that's it. He kicks your arse for you. He bars you. Then he doesn't have to listen to you anymore, and he does whatever he fancies." And as John says this, the first is kind of having a revelation, it seems. His eyes are wide open as he takes in what John is saying. And then he kind of whispers out loud, "No." Now that John's confidence has built back up, he stands and he says, "Let me put it this way. If I could have gotten rid of the little voice in my head, the one that told me to stop you carting Brendan off to hell, don't you think I would have? I'd have been out of there like a sodden shot, mate." And the first looks very angry at this, and he yells at John saying, "What are you laughing at?" And then he rushes to John, and he grabs him by the collar, and he shakes him saying, "Don't you laugh at me, you little bastard. I tried to make it better." But John just looks him right in the face and continues laughing, saying, "That's what they all say." Then he looks the first of the fallen straight in the eyes, and he gets serious, and he says, "You're just another tosser, thought he'd led us to the promised land. So you've twigged you were played for a twat in the first place. Big bloody deal. Don't come whining to me about it, bollocks." And the first of the fallen yells back, "You piece of shit! Who the hell do you think you are?" And then the first of the fallen stops dead in his tracks, and he has a look of shock on his face. And over this panel, we get the narration from a bunch of different quotes that all of John's friends have said to him throughout Garth Ennis' run. And I don't remember everybody who said each quote, but I'll do the voices for the ones that I think I remember who they were from. So the narration says, "You're a man who inspires the maximum loyalty for the minimum effort. Do you know that? It's not so bad being the lowest form of frickin' life. Doesn't matter what you call us, as long as we're good for a quick screw. You don't owe me any apologies." And as we turn the page, we get a full page spread of all the side characters and past people that were in John's life. And in this collage of faces of John's old friends, we can see Kit, we see Helen, we see Matt, the old cancer patient that John was friends with at the beginning. We see Heather and Rick the Vic, Chaz and Brendan, and Sarah, who was his current girlfriend, and even the Lord of the Dance. And it's funny because each of them have a different look on their face depending on how they felt about John. So some of them are smiling, some of them look sad. Chaz looks very annoyed, as well does Sarah. So it's kind of like an answer to the first of the Fallen's question of who does John Constantine think he is? He is all of the things that all of these people think about him, or at least that's how I interpret this. And over their heads, we get quotes from each of them of things they've said to John in the past. And just like before, if I can't remember who said it, I'll just kind of say it in a normal voice. So the quotes continue saying, "But your friends, that's different. We ended it so badly. I need to get on with my life, but I can't do it without seeing you, John." Bloody hell. All right, my son, how you doing? We get a sniff of sorcery and oh, what plans we make. We'll shake creation and leave nothing but smiles and wit and a reputation all men envy. You wee bastard. I've nothing to say to you. All you do is make things worse. You'll be in heaven half an hour before the devil knows you're dead. Sure, give us the bottle, and we'll say no more about it, Wah. Goodbye, John. You're a rake at the gates of hell. So at this realization, the first of the Fallen throws John back onto the ground, and he rushes out to the balcony, I guess to get some air. And as John struggles to get up, he says, "What's the matter? Got no friends?" And of course, this pisses the first of the Fallen off, so he turns around and snaps, "Right, let's talk about friends. What happened to all your friends, Constantine? What happened to the friends you tried to lead to the promised land?" Then we hear someone off panel say, "That sounds like my cue." And as John looks behind him, he sees the demoness form of Astra, and he freaks out and he yells, "No! For Christ's sake, get her away from me! I don't want to look at her!" And then the first of the Fallen walks towards him smiling as John yells, "Bastard! Dirty, bloody bastard! Take her away!" And as the first walks towards him, of course he doesn't listen to John. He says, "Damned, betrayed and butchered. Oh, you're good to your friends, aren't you? What'd you say to her when you led her into the inferno? Trust me?" And then Astra corrects him, saying, "He said, take my hand. Don't be afraid. I'll look after you." And at this, John bursts into tears, and in despair he yells, "I'm sorry." And then the first of the Fallen picks John up by his jacket collar once again, but this time he's like holding him in the air. And it seems John is begging, looking at him with fear, saying, "Please, please," which is pretty unsettling because John doesn't beg. But the first of the Fallen looks at him and says, "I was looking forward to this, but it's an anticlimax. You're nothing to speak of, really. A little gambler's luck and dog shit for a heart. That's all you are. You sent a little girl to hell, and it's been downhill ever since." And then he leans in even closer to John's face and he says, "We may as well play out our roles then. I'm the devil, and you're the sinner, and we both know where you're going now." So he extends his arm that he's holding John out with, and you can see his other hands kind of forming into a claw or a fist, like he's about to rip John's heart out. And just as he's about to do that finishing move, we turn the page and we see the first of the Fallen has been stabbed in the back, and the blade is sticking out of the front of his chest, so it's gone all the way through his body. And we have seen this blade before. It is the blade that Astra forged out of the other two Kings of Hell when he defeated them a couple issues back. And there's another thing interesting about this panel, and that is that the demoness Astra is not the one behind the first of the Fallen. Now she has turned back into her real form of John's demon friend Chantanelli, the one who came to John with her boyfriend who was an angel when she was pregnant. So we haven't seen her this whole time because she's been working in the background pretending to be demoness Astra. Now as the blade comes through the first of the Fallen's chest, he looks very surprised, but you can't really tell if the blade's doing anything. But all of a sudden, from the wound, a bright light begins to come out. And as he turns to see his betrayer, he sees Chantanelli, and his skin begins to crack all over, and light begins pouring out of those cracks. And as the first of the Fallen sees Chantanelli and realizes this was all a trick, and that he's been betrayed, with fear on his face, he asks, What'll happen to me?" But there's no answer. We don't really see what happens to him, other than he is not there when John wakes up, because John passes out. But it seems like he was just swallowed up from the light or something because there's no mess of him anywhere, so it doesn't seem like he exploded. So as we turn the page, John is beginning to wake up to Chantinelli saying to him, "Come on, wake up. You're not dead." And as John sits up, we see that Chantinelli is holding something bloody in her hands. And John sees this and he says, "Bloody hell, Ellie. What's that sodden thing?" And Ellie replies, "Fronds of cancer cells. I've just pulled them out of your lungs. Now that he's gone, I can do anything." And John replies, "Well, do me a favor and dump it for Christ's sake." And she stands up and says, "I just did you a big favor, boy." And then John sits up and asks, "Where is he?" And Chantinelli replies, "Wherever the devil goes when he dies. If he didn't know himself, how do you expect me to know? Scared the hell out of him anyway." And John says, "Yeah, speaking of which, that was a bleeding disguise and a half to choose, wasn't it?" And Chantinelli answers, "It was the only thing that would get me close enough without him becoming suspicious." So it seems that John didn't know about this part of the plan. I guess maybe the original plan was just become friends with the first of the fallen and then betray him at the end. But John didn't know that she was going to disguise herself as the demoness Astra. So when John saw her, all those tears and despair and him yelling sorry, that was all real. And I think that's why John needed Nigel, because when he originally was talking about going to visit Nigel, he was saying that he needed to get a hold of her, and that was the only way to communicate with her was through Nigel because he's psychic. But because Nigel was dead when he got there, he wasn't really able to talk to Chantinelli at all. He was just kind of hoping that through this, the loose plan that they had started would pay off. And in continuing explaining why she chose Astra, she says, "I didn't have room to worry about opening wounds in your conscience, John." And as John lights a cigarette, he says, "Suppose not." Then we cut to a little while later, and they're still in Nigel's apartment, but John has cleaned himself up a bit because he had bits of lung and blood on his face from earlier. So as he cleans himself up, Ellie comes in and asks, "What'd you make of his big speech?" And John replies, "True or false, do you mean? I don't know. More of a laugh than the one where we all grew out of monkeys, isn't it?" And Chantinelli replies, "A laugh? Christ, John, don't you ever give up? Even after all this?" And John answers, "Nope." So it seems that John, hearing the story from the first of the fallen that drove the priest to become a serial killer, did not have that same effect on him. And John explains, "If I was going to do that, I'd have managed to by now, wouldn't I? I blame it on all sorts of bullshit, make all the excuses I can think of, but I don't want to change, and I never let anyone help me try." And Ellie sadly says, "No matter what, the pages you gave me, the history of the fallen, they cost Heather his life, didn't they?" And John somberly answers, "Yeah." And Ellie says, "Yeah, everything I heard tonight made sense to me, John. And in case you've forgotten, you owe me now." Then Ellie walks out of the room, and as we turn the page, we see John is walking down the streets by himself, so Ellie has left him, and it also seems like the riots have kind of died down because he's able to walk down the middle of the street, and even though things are on fire, there's no police or people rioting. And as he's walking, he just happens to look over and see George resting against a car. So he walks over to him and he says, "Fancy meeting you here, George. All over then? How'd it go?" And sadly, George replies, "Like sodden Armageddon. There's about 30 dead for starters. Christ, we just kicked the shit out of each other for a day or two, and then everybody pissed off home. Now all I've got to look forward to is spending my life on the run." And then John lights a cigarette and sarcastically says, "And the bad news?" And George replies, "Ho, ho, ho. It happened because of me, you know that? Me and me sodden temper. All this friggin' waste. I started out thinking about black power and solidarity, and yeah, at last we're standing up against them." And then he gets really sad and says, "Will got a broken neck. Shelley got her brains kicked out all over the pavement. Spaz. Jesus, you should have seen the mess they made of Spaz. All I can think of now is that me mates all died, and it's my fault. I keep telling myself this was going to happen anyway, with or without me. We had to stand up to him, and Spaz and everyone would have died anyway. But none of it means a bloody thing beside the idea I got my best friends killed." And here, John, of course, has some experience dealing with the loss of friends, especially when it was probably you that caused them to die. So he kind of goes the tough love route, and he says, "So what do you expect me to say about it?" And at this, George looks up at John, very shocked, and John continues saying, "You were right when you told me I wouldn't understand, because I've always got a choice. I don't know what to tell you. The only thing I dare to say to you is, mate, You've got to keep that idea you've got. Don't ever forget it. You let that little twinge of guilt stay with you and slide up close to you on long winter nights, and maybe you'll get some good out of it. And then John turns around and he begins to walk away, saying, Christ, I don't know. I'll see you, George. And George calls back to him, You take care on your way home, Whitey. Long way to civilization. And before we get to John's reply to this, I'm going to have to give some context, because John says something pretty shocking, and I did a little bit of research to see if anyone else had context for what John says here, and no one else really caught what I think is happening here. So there is a song by the band Sly and the Family Stone that came out in 1969, so right in the middle of all the race relations issues in America. And the opening lines of this song are, Don't call me N-word, Whitey. Don't call me Whitey N-word. It's like a call and response, and obviously this song was supposed to be about the racial tensions that had come to a head in the 60s. And the people in Sly and the Family Stone are all African American, so it's a lot less shocking if they say that. But I believe John is quoting the song here back to George because George calls him Whitey. And then John says to him kind of sarcastically, like there's an inside joke between them. And he's even looking back at George with a smile on his face as he says, Don't call me Whitey, N-word. Except, of course, he doesn't say N-word, he says the actual word. And I know this has been very controversial for people that read it nowadays, but we know John as a very stringent anti-racist, as you've seen throughout the whole series. So the only thing I can think is that this song is very apropos to the situation, and it's kind of like an inside joke to them because John is assuming that George knows the lyrics to this Sly and the Family Stone song, which it appears he does because in the next panel, we see George just giving John the finger with a smile on his face. So it does seem like he's definitely in on the joke. So I'm not trying to excuse anything necessarily because obviously he shouldn't have said that word, but just wanted to give full context because I hadn't heard anybody say that those are the words to a song he's quoting, and it's not just some racist comment out of nowhere. So as we turn the page, we cut to John and Helen talking. And Helen looks much better. She's definitely detoxed. She still has bandages on and an eye patch over her left eye. And she's not wearing hospital gowns anymore. She's wearing like normal clothes. And her and John are sitting at what looks like a diner. So we come into the middle of their conversation where Helen is telling John, Suppose I could get a glass one, couldn't I? Better than wearing a patch all the time like some sort of bloody pirate. And John replies, Must be a weird feeling, love. And she answers, Nah, I've had 2 months to get used to it. Your vision goes funny for a while, then the other eye adjusts. And John is still feeling kind of guilty over all this. So he says to her, Taking it well, aren't you? Christ, Helen. If it wasn't for me, you'd still have both your eyes. But Helen looks at him and kind of smiles a little bit and says, Hey, if it wasn't for you, I'd still be on the game, selling myself to get money for smack. I'm lucky I got off as easy as I did. But John doesn't really say anything to this, and it turns out she's been waiting for a bus, so she says, You walk me to my coach, eh? And John agrees, so they walk outside to the bus, and it says Glasgow on it, so she's apparently going to Scotland. And as she's about to board, John hands her luggage and awkwardly says, Well then. And she takes the bag from him and looks up and says, Well then indeed. Thanks again, John. You've been brilliant. And John, who still feels guilty about everything, tries to cut in saying, I seriously doubt it. But she puts her finger to his lips and says, You have. Look, if this was a film or something, I'd still be in one piece and you'd be able to make sure nothing went wrong for me again. We'd probably live happily ever after. But it's not, is it? It's just up and down and random untidy old life. I'm not saying I'll never end up whoring again, or even going back to being a smackhead, because I haven't a clue what'll happen to me. There's no rules, no absolutes where people are concerned. That's the only thing I'm certain of. But you gave me a chance, Johnny. It's just a tiny, tiny wee thing. But Christ almighty, thanks for it. And John, still being modest, says, I didn't do anything. But he stops his protesting as she leans in and gives him a kiss on the cheek, and she says, Yes, you did. You're very special, Johnny. As long as you've people who think so, you always will be. And then she gives John a hug, and he hugs her back, and he begins crying. Then we cut to Helen being gone on the bus, and John is walking down the sidewalk, and he lights a cigarette, and his narration says, When I let her go, it felt like life itself was slipping through me fingers. I started to say something, I don't know, something bloody stupid and sentimental, something not very Constantine at all. But she knew as well as I did that it wouldn't last for long, that I'd be no use if I came with her, and even if I did change, shit, I'd just laugh it off and drown it in bravado. So the last thing she said to me, her smile getting wider all the time, was, "Good night and God bless. Now fuck off to bed." And in thinking about this moment, John gets a smile on his face as he smokes. And that, my friends, is the end of the Rake at the Gates of Hell arc, and also the end of the Garth Ennis run of Hellblazer. And man, that was a blast reading that whole run again. It was maybe like 15 years since the last time I read it all the way through, and I had forgotten a lot of stuff that happened. So hopefully you guys enjoyed it as much as I did. And the next issue, I believe, Jamie Delano is returning for, I think, either a 1 or 2 issue story arc. So that should be fun. So if you guys have any comments, questions, or suggestions, you can email me at planestrains and comic books, all one word, at gmail.com. And we will see you on the next one.